Please understand, I know that with what is happening in the US, I could have chosen so many examples related to today's topic. But I'm focusing on this particular case because it's happened a while ago, and people have been able to study how the media used this specific case of police and police force in a way that helps me be less emotional about it, right? So yes, I could use just about what happens almost every single day these days, which makes me very sad. But I decided to stick with this specific case because there is a bit of time in between when it happened and now, and also the studies that have been made. Right? So we're not just on the emotional level, but actually a more also intellectual level. So my question is, yes, would you know who this guy is? The one I put a square around, Rodney King? Anybody? That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, so as I was saying, right, that's the TV news. So why, for me, this is a great example of how we need to be critical when it comes to TV news is how it all happened. Actually, what happened to Rodney King led to a very, very impressive situation, mainly in Los Angeles, but not just in Los Angeles. It spread in other cities. But because Rodney King was from LA, that's where the biggest events happened. And yes, as you can see, I'm calling this riots. Literally, people went crazy. Burning stores, cars, houses, fighting, shooting each other. It really started as a beating, and I'll show you because we have the videos. And I'm not saying it's a small thing, it's just that it was one guy, several police officers, but then it just exploded into something that a lot of people from Los Angeles still remember, right? So that was 1992. What happened was that, as we are too familiar with nowadays, Rodney King, as you may remember from the picture, is African American. And he was driving, and the police pulled him over, and for no legal or human reason, right? He wasn't speeding, he wasn't doing anything weird on the road. He just got pulled over and ended up being seriously beaten like crazy by police officers. And I know this is not a happy video, but I just want you to understand that for me, there is absolutely no doubt that excessive force, like they like to use, right? Like too much force were used against him, knowing that he was not doing anything wrong, right? So I'll show you the video now. I do apologize, it's not a fun one. I know you see it on the news a lot, but I want you to really understand what happened for that person. Despite what you saw and you heard, right, the main person in charge of police officers in Los Angeles admitted a number, how many times they kicked him, and he thought that was not appropriate. The thing is, the police officers were found not guilty. I'm sorry, maybe I'm naive, but when I look at what happened, I can't understand why they decided this, right? So they went to trial, they actually went to trial, but they were found not guilty. And because of that, yes, a lot of people, and not just African Americans, went to the streets and went crazy, right? So that's the Los Angeles riots. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, some movies have had a huge power on me, and this is one of them. And I do use it quite a bit, actually. It's called The Freedom Riders. And the reason I'm using a scene from this movie is because it's a true story. It takes place in Los Angeles 3 years after the riots. And the movie is showing the racial tension in a high school in Long Beach, and how an English teacher tried to break this situation and make the students work together, right? The book is incredible, the movie is amazing, right? So I highly recommend it. But the first scene of that movie actually shows, because it's really hard to find videos from that time on YouTube, but it shows you how crazy people went, basically. So let me show it to you. The way I usually summarize these riots, it's a terrible story, definitely, that's where it starts. It's the wrong verdict, right? So the fact that the police officers were judged not guilty was not the right decision, right? And it was especially bad news coverage, right? What is interesting to look at, and that's why we usually need to have a little bit of time so that people start studying how we see it on TV. And remember back then, right, the guy who actually filmed the beating, it wasn't with a smartphone. They didn't exist back then, right? So it was just a video camera. The power of TV, I think, was even greater back then, right? Because nowadays we have so many, different ways to get information, but back then TV was definitely almost the only easy way to get information. So the news report, the way the news report showed the riots had a huge impact on how people reacted to it. I have a couple, by the way, I'm using if you want all the details, if this is something interesting to you, the person I'm using, it's Smith Erna at the bottom of page 6, right? She's got a very long, very well-researched and detailed paper about the Los Angeles riots. I'm using some part of it, right, to explain to you. What Smith did first is that she looked at actually who was arrested, right, during the riots. Obviously, the police did stuff, right, and they arrested people. And so I show to you the by races, right? So that's how they were registered. So as you can see, the most people the police arrested were Latinos, right? So people with usually from maybe South America. Another way to describe them, most of them do speak Spanish, right? That's kind of a way to describe what Latinos are. That's why I hate this, because I think this is ridiculous, but anyway. So as you can see, most people they arrested were Latinos, then you got African Americans, 38%. You did have white people, and actually Matthew even thought about going. Thank God he didn't. And yes, you do have Asians, because in Los Angeles there is a little Korea, and the Korean population in LA is actually quite big. And I think if you picked it up when I showed you the scene from Freedom Riders, you see a Korean guy shooting a gun, right? So yes, Asians also got involved in the riots. So this is who got arrested. And surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, it's what the TV showed was kind of reversed, right? Most people who got arrested were Latinos, but the people who were most shown on TV were African Americans. So they kind of reversed almost perfectly the percentage. And then they made the Asian population much bigger, right? It was only 2% got arrested, but the number of times when you saw rioters, people in the streets, it was 12% Asians, 48% African Americans, and 31% Latinos. Right. To help you visualize it next to one another, as I was saying, almost a reverse here, and definitely a way bigger percentage for Asians. And if you do watch Freedom Riders, you'll see the Asian community in California is a pretty strong one and has lots of issues with the other ethnic groups. So that might explain why Asians were also kind of targeted with this. And this is what we actually talked about also in the first semester, the problem of frames, right? And let me explain first what frames mean. And yes, I am still using the paper written by Erna Smith. So maybe you're not familiar with the idea of frames in journalism, but another one would be a story angle, right? Like the angle they're using to show you the story, right? Or another one, more even in crowd, is news peg or hook, right? That's what the other words you can use. And what a frame does is that it shapes the way journalists organize the facts, right? And you need to understand that the way these facts are organized, the meaning is going to be affected, right? So journalists are getting all sorts of information, then they need to make a decision. How am I going to organize this? And that is their frame. How do they choose how they organize the information? Usually, what is most important. And last week, two of you, I'm not actually sure they're here today. I don't see them. The idea was that to get people's attention, you're going to try to use things that are going to shock them. So it's considered most important, right? You want people to watch your TV newscast. You want people to buy your newspaper. But it might not necessarily be the truth. And that's the sad part, right, about that whole TV news thing, or the news in general. So journalists make decisions on how they show us information, and the way they show us information influence how we understand the situation. So with what I just explained, with who you would see on TV during the riots, the most people you would see would be African Americans, then Latinos, and then Asians, right? And that shapes people's understanding that it is a problem mainly connected to African Americans, which would make sense since Rodney King he passed away, not because of the beating, he passed away later on, was African American, but actually, it wasn't, right? So, and the way they are conveyed, the way they're showing it to us is, you got different ways of doing it, right? It's the script. So literally what the journalists say on TV, right? So they're going to use words, and these words are going to influence us, obviously. Maybe not so obvious is usually how they start and how they finish, because that's what our memories remember most, right? The beginning because it catches our attention, and the end because it's the last thing we heard. So it's very important to pay attention to how the story starts and how the story ends, because this has a lot of influence on how we understand the news. Another one, people interviewed, right? Who are they asking opinion of, right? Is it mainly white people? Is it actually people from the minorities? You'll get different answers, right? Different perspectives. So hopefully, no, it didn't happen, you would interview everybody to hear everybody's opinion about it. But that wasn't the case. It was mainly white people being interviewed. And what they call sound bites, so what you hear besides people talking, right? So what we watched for the first scene of Freedom Riders, you could hear gunshots, you could hear sirens, you could hear people screaming. This also is going to influence you, right? If I had put classical music behind the pictures, I'm sure it would have had a different effect on you, right? But with the whole intense atmosphere, with the sounds, it's also influencing you. The visuals, right? That seems pretty clear. What you see is clearly going to influence you. So again, who are they showing? What are they showing? you need to understand that when there is, when people do go overboard, when they do crazy stuff, there are always people trying to calm it or trying to make it better. We never see them. We see the fighting, the problems, right? We never see the people who are trying to make it better. And a lot of people were trying in Los Angeles to, talk and help people see that this was not the solution, right? But we never see them. So journalists tend to show us the dramatic, right? What is really big and scary and sometimes almost fantastic. So these are kind of the little my recommendations, right? If you want to be critical watching TV news, nowadays that includes videos, whatever you can watch that's going to show you the news. Try to pay attention to this, right? The script, what do the people say, the story leads in and closings, how does it start and finish, who are they interviewing, what do you hear in the background, and what you see. This should help you be a bit more at least less emotional. At least that's what it's done to me, right? Not instead of reacting right away with strong emotions, of becoming better and better at trying to, okay, hang on. This is what they decided to show me. This is not perfect reality, right? And I guess other questions then, what frame or angle, when you can be less emotional about it. And obviously, is it the only one? And usually it's not. You always have other things happening that they're not showing you, which I understand. They can't show everything either, but they always show the same thing. So it'd be nice to have a little bit more variety there. So the conclusion from the study, and many more actually, I just chose her because I really like the way she approached it in a very personal, human way, right? It wasn't just statistics. She actually interviewed people. She tried to get a feel for how everybody was feeling back then. So the conclusion that Smith has is that it was framed as a black riot, even though a lot of other minorities or ethnicities, I don't like saying this, ethnicities were involved. What we saw were violent people, not just screaming, but actually physically violent, assaulting, so attacking others, burning stores, houses and cars, and yes, they were mainly African Americans. And looting, that's another one a word that we'll use in 2 weeks, another one, so that's why I'm introducing, for week 4. Looting, so stealing, that's another word, right? Like you break into a store and you steal stuff during crazy circumstances. And we'll talk about Hurricane Katrina in the US for looting. So also stealing was shown as being done mainly by African Americans. And yet, we saw earlier, it wasn't just them, right? It was a lot of other people involved in all of this. It's funny because the white people were like 9-9, right? It was like the only equality there. They showed more of the reality. And so I really like this conclusion, right? It's not because it looks real on TV that it is real. What Smith says is that the power of television lies, and it's kind of a funny one, you can understand it in 2 ways, but is in its ability to literally bring the news to life. What she's saying is that TV news are really good at making it look real, right? Because they have the sound, the visual, and the action part, right? Whereas if you read it on paper, it's mainly words, maybe a picture. So pay attention, right? Everything that's in video format has a very strong ability to make us believe it's actually the truth, the one and only truth, which is not necessarily the case. And another aspect, what I resent very much the media for, is the last part of the handout, and what I call sensationalist news covering. Because actually, a lot of people believe that the riots may not have happened if the news had made a very important decision at the beginning of the whole thing. And so I can't say this. Sensationalism, here you go. It's a really hard word for me to say. It's what that means is you use exciting or shocking stories or language, right? Can combine all of that. And it's almost against the truth, right? It's playing against what reality is. But the goal is you want people to be interested, right? You want them to go, wah, kind of. And that was definitely the case in the Los Angeles riots. Clearly, that was meant. They wanted people to go, this is not right. And I'll show you why. And it started with a trial, right? So once Rodney King was out of the hospital, they had a trial. And as I said, the police officers were acquitted. So they decided that they were not guilty. And it happened at 1 p.m. So it's a time frame thing, right? Sometimes I say that actually a lot. Timing is everything, and that is very true for this one, right? So the verdict, the judges, I'm not sure if it was a jury thing, but anyway, the judge decided they were not guilty at 1 p.m. But the prosecutors, so the people who were against them, they asked for 2-hour delay. So they asked the journalists to not say anything for 2 hours. They wanted them to wait until 3 p.m., right? Yes. I'm not a math teacher. So yes, until 3 p.m. And the reason is, 1 p.m., back then, not many people were home or watched TV, right? Most kids were at school, parents were also at work. Whereas 3 p.m., you had many more people who could be watching TV at that time. So actually, the prosecutors and the TV news crews wanted the verdict, right, the decision to have a bigger impact. So they waited. If they had made it public at 1 p.m., most analysts think that it would never have gotten that big. It's the fact that at 3 p.m. they reached so many people at one time, and clearly the verdict is wrong, that people just exploded, right? It just created like a little bomb in everybody's home, and whoever was really angry already just went crazy. So that's also what a lot of people reproach the media for. The covering was not meant to just tell the truth. It was meant to make people go crazy, to have a big impact. And as I was saying earlier, actually, Los Angeles was the biggest one because, everything was happening down there. But actually, sadly, it started also smaller riots in other part of the country. So we don't have much coverage because it wasn't big enough. But a lot of other events happened because of this. So anti-police actions, smaller riots, and it really could have been avoided because in the end it didn't really help anything, right? It's as usual, you go crazy but nothing really changes. Proof is what is happening nowadays, right? It's not like the police got better with in this case, I'll call them minorities, right? When they handle someone who's not white, it becomes a bit way too radical. For me, the conclusion is, from what I've read, I do believe it was excessive. It was way too much meant to impress, not to inform. The problem spread, right? What happened in LA got out of hand and caused a lot of sadness and troubles in Los Angeles. This is something I resent CNN for. We do have international students. Usually ask them in 3 or 4 weeks if they're new. I mean, 2 of them have been here for a while. CNN drives them crazy because it's always on in the Kokusai Center. And I don't know if you know, but the catchphrase for CNN is, "We are reporting the news as it happens." And I would like to change it to this. We're reporting the news before it happens. It sometimes feels they're manipulating things so much that they're anticipating things that could lead to very negative things, like what happened with the Los Angeles riots, right? They on purpose waited for 2 hours before they went live with it. So just keep in mind, this is the message for today. And I know I've been talking about TV, but as I said at the beginning, remember, back then, really the most visual people were getting was from the TV. Nowadays, we even have more, right? So TV news influence the way we understand information, and they do it on purpose, right? They have very specific goals to do this. And they, as we saw with the LA riots, they sometimes make the news bigger than it is or more interesting. Actually, that was something the French news are very good with the bigger. They have a gift at turning one little thing into the end of the world. It's quite interesting. I'd like to find actually a French news segment that I would translate for you so that you can see, and then I could tell you what really happened. It's incredible how good they're at this. So I'm not sure what's happening in Japan. A, I don't have a TV here. B, my Japanese is not anywhere close to allowing me to watch the news, but maybe pay attention, right, when you're watching the news in Japan. Do you think they're trying to make it more interesting, or do you think they're trying to turn the little thing into something huge, right? Way bigger than it is. That's the whole thing with the critical thinking, right? We can't change this unless there's a complete, remodeling of journalism, which is not going to happen anytime soon, at least. So it's our responsibility to be critical. I know it's annoying, right? Because it's making us responsible for others' actions. I realize this, but that's what it is. That's what we have to deal with, right? We have to be critical in the face of what we see on TV or nowadays anything that you see on your computers, smartphones, tablets, whatever, right? So this is it for today. Wow, I beat the time. Woohoo! So thank you very much